ends up with a limp. We see, for example, that something is going on with Leah's eyes. We don't really know what it is, but we know there's something with Leah's eyes. We don't understand that her eyes are rakot. We don't know what it means. Does it mean it's a positive? Does it mean it's a negative? It's very hard to know. And I don't want to spend the time now. But we see these different characters just in the book of Breshit. We also, I find it very interesting, frankly, that the snake in the garden, the consequence of the snake's action is that the snake loses its legs. Like, where does that fit in? I'm actually not sure where it fits in, but I find it interesting. So we're just looking at this very limited text. And when you look through the lens of disability, suddenly we see an amount that we hadn't seen before. But what's really interesting is that none of these people are victims. Like, these are not characters who are victims. They are major characters, and they are standing up and doing their thing. And they are causing the narrative to go, and they are leading to the next generation getting the covenant, right? Like, these are major players who are struggling with various issues of disability. So when you think about it, what does it mean? You know, I always like to talk about the most important question in biblical studies, and maybe in all studies, but I'm a biblicist, so I'll just say in biblical studies, is so what? Like, why is it important? Why does it matter? Why is it significant? So I actually find it kind of interesting that when we look at the Bible in general, one of the issues we see in the biblical text is that it is always the younger son who wins out, right? It is very rarely the older son that wins out. In very rare cases, does the older son win out. Mostly in cases where there are certain lines, like the Davidic line goes, the priestly line goes, but even sometimes there, it's not the older son. But most of the time, it is the younger son who wins out. So why is that? Why is that significant? Well, when we study about the younger son, one of the ideas that is often put forward is that the blessing goes to the one you wouldn't expect. The one who seems weaker is actually stronger. The one who looks like he's not going to do anything, or she is not going to do anything, is the one who is going to be successful. And this was probably a message of great hope to Israel, because no matter when you place the timing of the Hebrew Bible, Israel was always smaller. It doesn't matter when. Israel was always smaller. It is generally understood in many scholarship, in much modern scholarship, that the Torah was canonized in the time of the Babylonian exile, which is the 6th century BCE, or very soon thereafter. So all the more so then were the Israelites, or the Jews at that point, smaller, less likely to succeed, less likely to think of themselves as successful, less likely to think of themselves as heirs to the covenant. And yet the biblical text's message is the one who you think is less likely to succeed is the one who is going to succeed. That's the one who's strong. What looks like physical strength is really not what gets you there. And that's the message of the younger son. Are you with me? So I think so too. We can say something very similar about the issue of disability studies, because I think it's not just the younger son that succeeds. In many ways in the Bible, or specifically in Genesis, it's the younger son with a disability who succeeds. When I said that Jacob is the one who ends up with a limp, when does he get that limp? He gets it specifically when he is named Israel, right? That wrestling with the angel is when he gets promoted, so to speak, from Jacob to Israel. So it's at that moment where he is taking his rightful place as the father of the 12 tribes, basically, is when he starts walking with a limp. So this is not something that's, by the way, this is not something that is insignificant, that we're trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. This issue of disability is at the core of our understanding of the biblical self-perception of the Israelites. Are people with me? Yes, we're okay? Okay. So this idea, I think, is something that could be seen as actually very hopeful and very positive in thinking about the biblical text. What's also very interesting is to notice that throughout the Bible, individuals with disabilities do very well. When you look at other ancient texts, what you generally see is that people with disabilities, this is like horror stories, right? They were abandoned. They were left out of the community. They were removed. Children who had any sort of disability were left to die, right? This is what we see in other cultures in the ancient world. And yet in the biblical text, we see our major heroes having disabilities. So I think it's very, very important that what we're seeing here is central to biblical thought. And that's the point I'm trying to make. It is not, by the way, it is not finding this little section and building a story out of it. So what I would like to, before I still get to the text, one of the things I like to think about is, I think in general, leaving Genesis for a minute, when we think about, for example, Moses has an issue with speaking, right? Which is fascinating. The greatest spokesperson of the whole Torah has trouble speaking. Fascinating. People are very well aware of the section in Exodus 4 where Moses says, I have a speech problem, right? That people know that text, it's known. But who thinks about Moses having a speech problem when we get to chapter 6? And who thinks about Moses having a speech problem when we get to Leviticus, when we get to Numbers, when we get to, are you with me? Like, we seem to ignore it. We know that it's there, we read it in its one little context, and then we let it go. And we don't think about the fact that how interesting that Moses was supposed to speak to the rock when Moses' hardest thing to do was to speak. How interesting that Moses, more often than not, acted instead of talking. And I'm not talking about when Moses talks to God, because I think talking to God is not like normal speech. But when Moses is not talking to God, and when Moses is talking to the people, more often than not, he says as few words as possible, or he does some kind of political theater, holding his hands up, falling on his face, doing something that is an action as opposed to speaking. But we forget to think about Moses in that way. I was thinking, for example, what would it mean to have had Charlton Heston have trouble speaking? What would it mean to have Prince of Egypt? I don't know who knows that movie, but it's worth it if you don't. Have him speaking with difficulty. Like, how interesting would it be to have a movie? There's enough biblical movies, Where do we have one that we see Moses actually struggling to speak? Imagine like the King's Speech kind of movie with Moses. How fantastic would that be? But no, we don't think about Moses that way. We just put his little problem into chapter 4 and then we're done with it. Similarly with Jacob, we know that he has a limp. We know that he struggles and he's injured, right? And from then on, he walks with a limp. But we forget that in the next chapter, he's still walking with a limp. And when everyone gets mad at him for not reacting properly to the rape of his daughter, we forget that he's feeling so physically vulnerable because he doesn't have the physical prowess that he had 2 chapters ago, 3 chapters ago, right? When he felt whole bodied, and he's still getting used to the fact that he walks with a limp. And maybe he was a little more nervous to meet up with, to fight against a whole community when he did not feel secure with his own body. Now, let me be clear. I'm not defending him. He really messed up when his daughter was raped. I'm not defending him. But I do think there's something to be said for recognizing that when we hear in the Bible that someone has a disability, think about how that impacts on the text to come. So I think it's a different way of thinking about the Bible than we usually do. And I think it opens our eyes in a way that is very, very valuable. How are we doing? Okay? Yes, good?
You have one comment, Aura,
Please.
from Phil. He said, by contrast, the Chumash prescribes that the Kohanim must be without any impairment or disability in order to serve.
Yes, and that is very true. And very troubling. And I'll take a minute on it. I'm not going to go a long time on it, Phil. I'm going to do it quickly, but if we have time, we can come back to this question. I think it is the exact right question, right? That this is a problem. The texts that talk about the biblical requirements for priestly participation, not all things, but important ones, they're offensive. They have a very long list of things that would keep a priest from being involved. And it's offensive. And frankly, many of us have those things. Like one of them is a broken limb. If you've ever broken a limb, you're one of those people. I'm one of those people. So it's not them, it's us, right? That are not allowed to be priests. And it is very difficult. And there are a number of ways of thinking about it. I might get to one of them in a little while, but I think I'm not going to say my favorite because I'm spending a lot of time on a different idea, but one idea that works for me, and I may bring this up in the panel at the end also, we'll see how it goes, is that one of the things I see in the Bible in a fair number of places is that there are legal and cultic laws. I guess it's not a legal law, legal and cultic texts that sometimes say one thing, and then we have a narrative text that's almost a corrective to the legal and narrative text. So we have some legal and narrative texts that are, I would say like this one, borderline offensive. And then we can see that there are narrative examples that show that that's only one view and that there are other views. So here too, I would say we have this section in Leviticus that talks about the prescribed bodily abilities that the priest has to have, or the ones that they can't have, which makes it think that you're saying everyone who has any problem is out, right? Is problematic. But then we have Moses and then we have Jacob. And you don't get any more important in the Bible than Moses and Jacob, right? Those are two really big, important characters. And so the fact that we have those, in my mind, in some ways is either a corrective or at least a sign that there are multiple viewpoints, and this is another one. So I'm going to just say that much right now, but to say that it is an issue, you're not wrong. It's an issue. And it's one I'm working on another way, and we'll see if we get to that. So what I'd like to do is to take you through an example of looking at a text through the lens of disability studies using the method I've been using. And the method I've been using, just to give you another moment, is really looking that I would consider the pshat of the text, the contextual reading of the text. I am trying very hard not to be interpretive. In other words, I'm trying very hard to say that whatever I'm looking at, I can cite someplace in the text that supports it. Other people may disagree. That's what it means to study text together. You disagree. It's okay. It's not a bad thing to disagree. But I believe from my own methodology, and the methodology really that I learned at JTS, is to really look at the pshat of the text, the contextual reading of the text, and to really say that you can find a place in the text that supports the reading. And then if someone disagrees with you, it's okay, because you can still support your reading. They may find another text that supports their reading. Great. That's okay. There's not only one reading of the text. We never have to dig in our heels to say only our reading is correct. There's multiple readings that can be appropriate and that can be supported by the text. But I try very hard to do that. So what that means is I don't think, emphasis on I don't think, I am not reading into the text. I am using the language of the text. Is that clear? Because that's important. Okay. So I want to show you what I do, and then we can go from there. So we're going to look at the character of Esav. And now's a good time to put up the resource sheet. And let me make you guys bigger so I can still see you. Okay. So if you can take us to the first, yeah, that's good, the first text. And I'm imagining that people will want to, many people here would want to see the English, I'm guessing. So if we can make sure to see both. So this is the beginning of the story of Isaac and Rebecca. And this starts with the question of Rebecca's ability to become pregnant, and then what her pregnancy was like. And what's really fascinating, if you look in the beginning, it was very hard for her to become pregnant. It's actually this quite beautiful love story that I think that Isaac prays on her behalf without being asked to pray on her behalf. There's something beautiful there. And she becomes pregnant. And when she is pregnant, if you look at verse 22, the babies were struggling inside her womb. And she said, if this is what it's going to be like, how do I survive it? She's, hormonal and upset, but she's really doing if this is what it's like, how do I live through it? But she's struggling and she's in pain. And what I love about this text, frankly, is this is the only example of the description of the pain of pregnancy in the Bible. We have the pain of childbirth, but we don't really have the pain of pregnancy in the Bible. And so this is like really our one example of the pain of pregnancy, and she's struggling. So how interesting. Why is this the first place or the only place where we hear about the difficulty of the pregnancy? And one answer that works and that makes sense, but let me say one other. Well, you may not like every specific answer, but the question is, are we building a house? Are we building an argument that's going to work? Is that what has been said is that mothers who have children who are ADHD often talk about really increased movement in the womb. And so more difficult pregnancies based on just the amount of movement in the womb. Sometimes I think it sounds a little circular because then they know their kids. So it always sounds a little circular to me, but I'll take it. And so, so here, one of the things we see is that it is only Rebecca that we hear that she has this difficulty in her pregnancy. So if we're going to try to see, is it possible to do a reading that Esav has ADHD, we can see something right from the beginning of his birth. As we move on, and like I said, each one of these arguments is not enough on its own, but it's when we put it all together, the question is, do we have something? So we just try to, build something as we see. We go from there into the section where we have the selling of the birthright. And we're still in this first text. And this is where many people know this story, where Esav was out hunting and Jacob was at home and he made this whole stew. And Esav came home and he said, what? I am going to die if I don't have something to eat. Give me something to eat. And Jacob basically said, no, I'll only give it to you if you sell me your birthright. And basically Esav said, I'm just going to die if I don't have this food to eat. So take it. I don't need it. I need the food. And he ate. And if you look at the end of it, look at verse 34, that Yaakov gave Esav the food, and it says, Vayocha, Vayesht, Vayakom, Vayelech, Vayivez Esav et habachora. It's a series of verbs. He ate, he drank, he got up, he left. And then we'll get to the next, that he despised his birthright in a minute. But we have this, in my mind, this is a very impulsive move. This is not someone who is looking at long-term consequences. This is someone who is acting impulsively. And that is what we're seeing of Esav, that he couldn't think about, well, this is going to be important for later, so I can, wait another half hour to eat and make myself something, because this is just that important. But no, he needed what he needed at the moment that he needed it. And this section where it says Vayivez Esav et habachora, often translated that Esau despised his birthright, that translation doesn't work for me, because we see later that he was so upset that he lost his birthright. It doesn't despise it. He's sad that he lost it. So I think a better translation is he squandered it, right? He lost out, he squandered it. So right from this beginning, we're seeing a few characteristics. And when we think about the characteristics of ADHD, many of the characteristics that we see are, for example, impulsivity. A question on the one hand, hyper-focusing and the inability to focus. We see both of those with individuals with ADHD at different times. We see often that people have difficulty with what we would call social consciousness. In other words, it's often difficult for people to pick up social norms by osmosis. They often have to learn social norms. They don't always expect the way people are going to act, because it's not as natural sometimes. And by the way, every person with ADHD doesn't have all these things, right? These are just the kinds of qualities that people talk about, the kind of characteristics that are associated with it. So far, we've already seen the movement. We've already seen the impulsivity. We've seen the lack of sense of long-term consequences. And there's something else really interesting, which is that in this text also, we're told that Esav is a hunter and Jacob is a farmer and a tent sitter, actually, not a farmer, a tent sitter. And he hangs out in his tent, whatever that means. There's a really interesting understanding of ADHD by a man named Tom Hartman, who says that people who have ADHD are descendants of hunters. And the problem is that our schools are built for farmers, and that hunters and farmers are two different kinds of people. to be a hunter, you have to be able to focus on one thing, but be very distracted by something else, right? So you have to be able to follow the prey, but know that you could become prey if you're not distracted enough by the noise around you, right? So that combination of hyper focusing and distractibility is really quite valuable to someone who's a hunter. But someone who's a farmer has to be able to go up and down the rows and do the same thing over and over and plant and wait and have a lot of patience and wait and then do a little weeding and wait. And then eventually your results are, but that process entails a certain kind of personality type. So his theory, and who knows, is that people with ADHD fit more into the hunter mode. And the problem is not that there's something wrong with these people, it's just that the schools were made for farmers. The schools were not made for hunters. So it's a very interesting theory, but it's especially interesting in thinking about Esav, that here it's especially Esav described as being a hunter. Okay, let's move on. And let's look at the next text. If you can keep going, great. So now we have the section which is that this is the stealing of the birthright as opposed to the stealing of the blessing as opposed to this selling of the birthright. And in this section, and this is familiar text, I'm betting that most people know these stories. What we see is that Isaac, who we've already seen has a very special relationship with Esav, calls Esav to him and asks him to go out and hunt for him, right? He says, Hinena zakanti lo yadati yomoti, verse 2 and following. I'm old now, I don't know when I'm going to die. Ve'ata sana chelecha tel yecha v'kashtecha v'tzei hasadeh v'tzuda litzayid ve'aseh li matamim kasher hafti v'havia li ve'ochela. Take your weapons, take your bow and your quiver, your weapons, and go to the field and hunt me some game and make me some food, the food that I love, and bring it to me, and then I'm going to bless you. This is an awful lot of instructions. And one would think that if Esav is an accomplished hunter, you don't have to remind him to take his weapons. And that you can say, go hunt me some game, and after I eat it, I will bless you. And I think that would be really very clear. But one of the things we see with people with ADHD is that they need the instructions, that a kid going outside needs to be told, in the snow needs to be told, take your hat and take your gloves and take your boots and put them on and zip up your coat and then go out and play, right? Because otherwise, in 5 minutes, they're going to come in and say their hands are cold because they forgot their gloves. And so here too, I think this is like this beautiful statement that one of the things that we see in how Yitzchak loves Esav is how Yitzchak knows how to talk to him. He knows what he needs to say. He knows how to talk to him. He knows how to help him be successful. And what I also love is in order to bless him, he asks him to do the thing he's really good at. He doesn't say, write me a poem. He doesn't say, sing me a song. He says, hunt for me. Like, do that thing that you're so great at. There's something so stunningly beautiful there. So again, we are seeing a quality in Esav. If we go down just a little bit more, I'm rushing through a little bit because I'm just trying to give you the picture. After Esav loses out and, his brother comes in, Yaakov comes in and acts like him and puts on the skins and says it's him and he gets the blessing. And Esav is, doesn't know what to do with himself. And if you look in the section in chapter 27, and he says, he's so angry, he wants to kill him, but he says, after my father dies, I'm going to kill my brother. I love this line because here we see Esav actually saying, Esav, we already know he's impulsive. We already know he doesn't think, long-term consequences, but he has such love for his father, he's able to hold it in right here. He's able to say, I'm going to do it after my father dies. I'm not going to go kill him right now. After my father dies, I'm going to. So there's something so stunning here in this love between Esav and Yitzchak. And then we see in the next one, in chapter 28, we see that at that point, Rebecca's worried, right? She's worried that Esav is going to kill Jacob. Not a ridiculous worry. And she arranges to have Jacob sent away. And the reason is that he should marry someone from somewhere else, right? He should marry the family. He should marry within the family, not outside the family. Before this text all started, we already saw that Esav married local women. And that his parents were upset about it. But here we see that Esav saw that Yitzchak had blessed Yaakov and told him that he should go marry from within the family, right? And Yaakov went to, his mother's family to marry. And then Esav saw that they don't want him to marry local people. And he goes and marries Yishmael's daughters. Again, beautiful. What we see here is that Esav, it seems, didn't know that this was not who he was supposed to marry. On some level, it seems that they had thought that he just got it, that that's not who he was supposed to marry. And so everyone was mad at him for marrying the local Hittite women, but he never knew. And as soon as he heard directly, you're supposed to marry within the family, he went and married Yishmael's daughters. Now, those were still not really the right ones to marry, but it was a really good attempt, and he was trying very hard. So there too, we see this is the point of like the social consciousness, that he needed someone to tell him. He wasn't going to pick it up on his own. He needed someone to tell him. Then the last text in chapter 33, this is after Esav has already done his thing, and he's now walking around with his 400 people. He seems kind of happy and successful. Yaakov has already been and married and gotten a lot of kids, and they meet up. And Yaakov is terrified because he thinks Esav is still going to kill him. And Yaakov tries everything to appease Esav, to give him gifts and to separate his camp, because if he kills these, maybe these will be saved, right? Yaakov is rightly, frankly, very nervous that he is going to come up with Esav and have struggle and have a problem. But Esav sees him, and what does he do? He runs up and he kisses and hugs him. And he says, I'm so happy to see you. I'm not, that's not exactly what it says, but he hugs him, he kisses him, they cry together. He tells, who are these people? Come live with me, let's travel together. That's how Esav responded. Now, what I find fascinating here is that Esav doesn't seem to get that Yaakov is nervous. And I compare it to when Yosef meets up with his brothers at the end, right? After everything that happened, and his brothers sold him into slavery, and all of this terrible stuff happened, and he meets up with his brothers, and what he keeps saying is, don't worry, I'm not upset because it's God who did this, not you. Don't worry, it's okay, right? He keeps saying that because he knows that, of course, his brothers assume that he's really mad and that he's going to take it out on them. Esav here is in the same situation, but he doesn't get that that's how Yaakov is feeling. Esav is over it. He's done. And he's now happy to see his brother. He doesn't get that Yaakov is upset. So again, it's missing a piece of social interaction that he just doesn't have. Let me take a minute here. Is what I just did clear? You may agree with it, you may disagree with it. You may think that we've built a case that you can read Esav as having ADHD. You may think we didn't. But what I'm really asking is the method I'm using clear to you? Yeah, any questions? Okay. So the reason I wanted to go through this with you is because I wanted you to see what it means to use the pshat of the text in the service of disability studies of the Bible, and how important it is to see that what we're not doing is just trying to build something on top of the text, but to actually dig in and use the text. Even if this language was not used in the ancient world, kind of doesn't matter. It's, if there are personality types, there are personality types. We just maybe didn't have language for them. So let me take a next step. Good. So what I would say next is in my own work, where I went next with this was in then thinking about God. Because what does it mean? It's one thing to see biblical characters as having disabilities, but what does it mean if we think of God as having disabilities? Now, let me be really clear what I mean by that. I'm not talking about any of our own views of God. Every person here probably has a different view of God, and that's a good thing. I'm talking about the biblical view of God and how God is portrayed in the Bible. And parts of the way God is portrayed in the Bible may fit with our own theologies, and part of it may not. And that's fine. That's a separate conversation. But what we do see in the Bible is that there are many different ways of looking at God. We look, God has, masculine characteristics. God has feminine characteristics. God is ruler. God is parent. God is spouse. God, right? Like there's a million images that we have for God. And each one of them, I would say, is this little piece, right? The fact that we see God as ruler, and here we see God as parent, doesn't mean one is right and one is wrong. It means it's two images of God. Are you with me? That's really important. So what I'm saying is, I think another image of God is of God having disabilities, which doesn't mean that there's not a lot of places where God doesn't have disabilities. And the place that brought me to that was Psalm 23. And in Psalm 23, I'll tell you the truth, how I got to this one was I was in a time in my life where I was having a lot of, for a good number of years, I had trouble walking. And I was using a cane for a good number of years. And I was coming up to something that I didn't want to be so obvious that I was using a cane, but I also knew that I had to. So I was struggling a little bit with it. And I was sitting in a service that I felt was a little bit clunky. And so it wasn't doing it for me. So I just started going through the Siddur and looking at things. And there was this beautiful woodcut kind of painting of Psalm 23 that I started looking at. And as I started reading it, and we all know this, right? Everyone knows Psalm 23 in Hebrew and in English. But what I saw is verse 4. Gam ki elech begeit salmavet lo ira ra ki ata imadi shivtecha umishantecha hema nachamuni. Even though I walk through the valley of deepest dark, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And we often think about that as the shepherd's rod, right? That the shepherd's rod is helping the shepherd get through. But as I looked at it that day, I realized that there's two words. There's shivtecha and mishantecha. Shivtecha is your rod, your staff, but mishantecha is the thing you lean on. It's something you lean on. So what is a stick that you lean on? Well, a stick that you lean on is a cane. And that's what you lean on. And so what if we understand this text as saying, I'm comforted by the fact that you, God, are walking with a cane. And I find that comforting. I find that beautiful. I find that really expanding the understanding of B'Tselem Elohim, what it means to be in God's image. And that when we are walking with a cane, whoever we are that need to, we're not doing it because we're not perfect. And I hate that word, and I'm using it on purpose. We're doing it because it's another way. I mean, we're doing it because we have a problem with our leg. But as we do it, we're doing it because we are still in God's image. And this is another way to be in God's image, is to be walking with a cane. And as we think about it, it doesn't mean that there's not other places that God's not soaring through the clouds, and other places where God's taking a walk in the garden, right? All those things are still there. This is not instead of those. This is just adding another image to the images that we have. And to me, it's very powerful. And when I think about the psalm, one of the things we often say about this psalm is that it's a pilgrimage psalm. In other words, it's a psalm that was used for pilgrimage times. And I think to myself, how hard when I say pilgrimage times, there were pilgrimage festivals where everyone was supposed to go to Jerusalem. And I just think how hard it must have been if you were a person that had trouble walking during a pilgrimage time, because it either meant you couldn't go because you had no one to take you, or it meant someone took you, but you felt really vulnerable because a lot of people were walking and you weren't. And you were fully dependent in some way that is hard. And so just imagine that here we have a pilgrimage psalm at a time when a lot of people who have trouble walking would be feeling difficulty. And then imagine what it would mean to them to have the image of God using a cane. Imagine how encouraging and positive that would be at that time. So what does it mean to really build on our understanding of God as having disabilities? And the little sections I gave after this are from a book I read about a man named John Hull, who is blind. And he talks about his interaction with the Bible as a blind person. And he uses these texts to talk about, you can look at them yourself. And God bowed the heavens and came down, and darkness was under God's feet, or clouds and darkness are around God, or God uncovers deep things from darkness, right? These are, we generally read these as metaphors. But when he reads them, he feels that he, as a blind person, is seeing himself in God. He is seeing himself as B'Tselem Elohim. Can we stop the screen share now? So yeah, thank you. So I can just see you better. So I think, and again, I'm not saying those are not metaphors. I'm fine if people want to read these sections as metaphors, but it's also quite beautiful for people to be able to say, I see God as, dealing with the same disability that I deal with, as that my life is in the image of God, whether I am a hearing, dealing with issues of being deaf, because people who are deaf see different places in the Bible that works for them. And it goes into different areas as well. So I think it's to me, it's a very powerful statement. And it really increases our openness to the vast array of types of people that make up our community, and that we're not one type and other. We are many types, and that we can see all of these types as being B'Tselem Elohim and in God's image. And no matter who we are and what we have and what we do, we are B'Tselem Elohim. We are in God's image. And we're not doing this by being metaphorical. We're doing this by expanding our understanding of God and our understanding of the biblical text. Are there questions or comments? Yes, David.
Well, a couple things. Thanks for all that you said in your view through looking at these things. I was just struck with, I never quite realized there were so many, I put in quotes, disabled people that really had a predominant role in the Bible. You know, it's just like, you know, so instead of kind of, as you were pointing to, instead of analyzing one at a time, the fact is that so many of them through all the different phases of the Jewish people had a role. And the other thought I had was that sometimes disabled people think they're less than, right? Or, oh no, I'm disabled, and as opposed to really what an honored position it is, that perhaps the disabled, if you will, are better or good platforms for the eternal to be expressed.
Yeah, that's a complicated thing. I would say that there are many different views of that question. I think for some people, they would feel perhaps offended to be, you know, what's the word, like objectified in that way, like that your disability is to teach us something, you know. And so I personally don't view it that way. And I think we also want to leave a lot of room for people having different views, even using the word disability. If you notice that Shuli, Professor Schwartz, in the keynote, she talked about being differently abled. And even that is a very political, right? Is it differently abled? Is it disabled? Well, some people feel, yeah, we should use the word differently abled because we all have different abilities. And some people say, that's not fair. I actually have a disability, and I should be acknowledged as having a disability. And it's not all equal, and the world is not set out for me, and I struggle more, and don't take that away from me. And others say, don't call me that. I'm not disabled. I'm differently abled. And, you know, so I think we have to leave a lot of room for people to self-identify and to tell us what they are comfortable, you know, how they are comfortable talking about themselves. And I shouldn't even be saying they, how we are comfortable talking about ourselves, because I would imagine that in this room are people, oh, are we supposed to make that go away? Are we in the last 60 seconds? Is that why that popped up? Okay. So just that we too, in this room, and I don't know most people here very well, but I am positive that there are people in this room who don't see as well as they'd like to. And I am positive that there are people in this room who don't hear as well as they'd like to, or who don't walk as far as they'd like to. So it's us. It's not them, it's us. And I think that idea that it's B'Tselem Elohim, it's us. It's all of us are in B'Tselem Elohim. So I'm going to leave it there. It's been very nice studying together. And those of you who I was saying in the beginning how happy I am to see you, I'm still really happy to see you. And be well, everybody.